I think I've always worked in a way that's been, it's just like taking it step by step, and it's been in a very linear way. Essentially, it's been like a kind of a thought process that's been illustrated by sculpture. And I think as my language has developed and as my kind of thoughts have developed, that's changed. And obviously now I have this much larger kind of vocabulary that I can work with, which is actually kind of more daunting in a way as well, because you have far more choices. So you have to, spend a long time scratching your head before you finally actually make it. Whereas I think initially it was very much a process of enjoying new materials, working out how to work with colour, working out how to work with form, working out how to make something sort of sit on the floor or lean against the wall. And now I kind of have all this information. The very, very first sort of cast that I made when I realised that you could sort of really change something was I pressed a spoon into sand and then poured some lead into it. And it lost the spoonness of the spoon, so the hollow of the spoon had gone and that had become flat, and you had this kind of little sort of lip around the side, and it completely changed it. From one side it still looked like a spoon, from the other side it looked like something entirely different. And I just kind of fell in love with that process. The first show that I made, which had a piece called Shallow Breath, it was the cast of a space underneath a bed, a piece called Mantle, which was the cast of a dressing table, and Torso, which was the cast of the inside of a hot water bottle. And they were the sort of 4 elements of things that I thought about as being part of either a kind of small bedroom, or it was really, I think, for me about leaving home and, leaving my family home, going off to college and staying in these crappy houses with other students. So that was my sort of sketchbook in a way, and also using sort of junk shops around London and, really having a good old sort of poke around to all of these places, looking at all this furniture. So that's where it kind of started. And then when I made Ghost, and I was really, again, thinking about my family home more. And I think really just trying to find a way of looking at the domestic as sort of, in terms of relationships and relationships with people, relationships that people have with their homes, relationships people have with their furniture. And it was trying to sort of bring all those things together and just, I think, quietly talk about maybe some of the darker things. I don't think that using forms that were related to death is something that I'm particularly, I don't find that sinister. I mean, people do, and people think that I'm, obsessed with death. I don't think it's sinister. I'm not, I think there's a very strange, especially in this country, sort of denial of death, and people don't quite know how to deal with it. People don't really understand it. People, hide. It's not like a kind of celebration of people's lives when someone dies. It's a terrible tragedy, which of course it is a terrible tragedy when someone dies. But I think it's, people have also lived their lives, and things are left behind, and memories are left behind. I think a lot of pieces like Amber Bed, for instance, which is the cast of a bed made in rubber, which came from after having made a lot of work in plaster, and I was sort of frustrated, and I was showing a lot as well, and I was getting frustrated with things getting broken and bits getting knocked off and whatever, and I wanted to make something out of a different kind of material that I could literally kind of bounce around the studio and it wasn't going to get damaged. And I did that with this material and made the cast of the space underneath the bed, which was similar to Shallow Breath, and then had it and didn't quite know what to do with it. And I was, it was very heavy, and I was kind of shifting it around the studio, and I just plonked it against the wall. And it did this amazing thing where it just sort of took on the shape of the wall and sat there slumped against the wall. And it looked like a body. And every time I turned round, I would get a shock thinking it was someone sitting in the corner of the studio. And of course, it started making me think about derelict people. It started making me think about homeless. It started making me think about Hackney and the mattresses that were left everywhere and still are left everywhere. I was using mattresses and beds for all sorts of reasons. But as you kind of work with these things and with, you know, with this material that people have slept on and people have died on and people have, you know, then inevitably it has this whole history and kind of resonance which becomes part of the work. I had this idea that I wanted to mummify the sense of silence in a room. I think that's what, mummify the air in a room. I didn't really know how I was going to make it. I didn't really know what it was going to look like. It was just, you know, almost sort of slightly naive. I just thought, well, I want to make this thing, so I'll just try and, you know, see what happens. And found this house up in Archway, which I was sort of delighted with because it was close to where I lived as a child. The room was the right sort of size, and I remember that there were certain things that I wanted in the room, which was a window, I wanted cornicing, I wanted a fireplace, and I wanted skirting board, and, you know, a door and a light switch. And then I spent weeks in there, I remember, deciding how it was going to be made, how it was going to be cast, what size the blocks were going to be. And I was thinking at the time, I remember, about Piero della Francesca's paintings, and I was thinking about proportion. So I was using proportion and also using how the fireplace sits in the room. So I was using that as a centre point and then working from that and worked all the way around. And this process went on for about 3 months, I think. And it really was a sort of learning process. And then I went home one day, came in the morning, and I remember the light was coming into the studio, really beautiful sunny morning, and I saw the light switch, and the light switch was back to front. And I just thought, what have I made? You know, I'm the wall. And it hadn't occurred to me, you know, at all before that. And I realised that I'd made this thing that was quite kind of bizarre, that I'd actually made myself the wall, I'd made the view of the wall. And yeah, it was another point, a real kind of moving point for me, and it's sort of quite a sort of revelation, I think. And I called it Ghost. House is obviously a piece that I'm incredibly proud of. I think it's, you know, a real kind of achievement to have made it. It's one of those things that I went into in a way that was, again, quite kind of naive, I think. You know, I just kind of thought, okay, well, let's just try and do this. And we did it, and it took an awful long time, and it was a massive headache, but ended up with this quite extraordinary sculpture, which touched people on many different levels, whether, you know, they were interested in art, or whether they were interested in politics, or whether they were interested in road building. The piece that I'm working on at the moment is called House, and it's very simply the cast of the inside of a house in concrete. It's a turn of the century terrace house, which is a typical kind of architectural style. I chose the particular house for exactly those reasons, because it's like a kind of archetypal house. What I'm actually doing is working on the interior walls of the house and literally making a building within a building. We're making the piece by building from the basement up. So we're starting with building concrete foundations, because obviously we can't use the foundations to the existing house because they're for the exterior walls of the house. So we've laid these foundations. We're then putting on a layer of white concrete, and then we tie in a metal structure which holds the next layer of concrete, which is like a heavy fill of concrete on top, which is a darker, heavier concrete. This all cures, and then we literally take the building off around the piece. I think house will have a mausoleum quality, but I also think it might be a little like a sort of fossil or something that's been excavated. It's very difficult to talk about the piece because I haven't seen it yet. You know, at the moment it's still all under brickwork. I'm hoping that it will have this very strong but slightly kind of fragile presence, because the actual width of the piece is only about 14 foot. The breadth of it is longer than that, and it'll draw one's attention to the very narrow living spaces that we normally live in. It may have a depth to it, but it's actually quite narrow. And once the two buildings are cleared from either side of it, there'll just be this rather strange kind of building just standing in the middle of this gully, which is in the middle of a park. The only regret that I have is that I don't feel that I ever really got to see it. I made it, nearly killed me making it, and I actually got quite ill making it. I mean, the stress of it and everything, you know, it was just totally kind of overwhelming. And then, you know, afterwards the kind of media flourish and attack and the Turner Prize and all sorts of other things that happened. And I think I found it a strain, really a strain, and would go and see the piece, but sort of go in disguise and, you know, sit in the car and with a sort of hat on and sunglasses, and just trying to figure it out and watching people watching it, and there were petitions to try and keep it up. I mean, everything you can possibly imagine kind of went on with this thing. And then it was knocked down. And Councillor Flounders was the guy who was, you know, virtually solely responsible for doing it. And he just was obsessed with getting rid of this thing. It's a shame, I think, that it didn't have a chance to become invisible, like architecture becomes invisible. And I think that's an interesting aspect, and maybe it's something that I will sort of work with at some point, but this wasn't meant to be with this piece. And it had this sort of fight for life, and, you know, now it's a park with closed gates, and people sort of throw their dogs over the fence to have a shit in there, and it's, you know, that's sort of what the place is now. And it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, it really is ridiculous, and there's probably very few countries in the world that would do that to you know, an artwork that had been such a success in many ways. But, you know, we managed to do it. So. It taught me how to become sort of tougher about not what I do, because I've always been very tough about what I do, but it's sort of dealing with the consequences of what I do, really, I think. And with the memorial in Vienna, which took 5.5 years to make, and I spent 2.5 years, really, really fighting to make it happen. And then I said, sod you, you know, sort it out yourselves. There's really a big problem here. I'm not from Vienna. I'm not, you know, not from Austria. And I didn't really understand what was going on. I mean, I knew what was going on, and I understood the politics, and I understood that it was really very, very tricky, the whole thing. But I didn't quite understand the machinations of how the political situation works over there. And it's extraordinary, incredibly bureaucratic, and also quite provincial. And it became very difficult to deal with. When I was asked to put in a proposal for the Holocaust Memorial, which was actually quite soon after House, I was quite reluctant. But then I started to think about it and think that it felt like a challenge to try and make something that was both sort of poetic and aggressive about the Holocaust. So really something that was quite kind of upfront and non-figurative. So it felt like a real challenge to do this. So I came up with this proposal, and it was for a very specific place in the historical sort of centre of Vienna, and a square called Judenplatz, which was in the what was the Jewish quarter, and it was this historical square, medieval square, that it originally had a synagogue on it. The synagogue was razed to the ground in the sort of 14th century, I think. Lots of Jews were burnt. Eventually, after 5.5 years, we now have in the square my memorial, excavations that you get into through the museum and a sort of Jewish history museum. And it's quite an extraordinary place, and it works incredibly well. But, you know, one of the main problems, I think, during the building of the piece was essentially the politics that go on in Austria. And there is quite a right-wing situation over there. I mean, that's all changed, and I think during the time that we were making the piece, the government changed actually 3 or 4 times. So there were kind of elections going on continually, which also made it very problematic. It was really about being on the outside of something and looking at something. And I think that was partly to do with the fact that I'm not Jewish, that I felt that I was dealing with a subject that was really something that I'd always known about, and something that I had some involvement, I mean, not really involvement, but I had friends of my family had friends that were in concentration camps, and I knew of people, and I knew of people's histories, and kind of dreadful things that had happened to them. And I was, I think, profoundly affected by that in some way. I lived in Berlin in 92, 93 for a year or so. And when I was there, one of the things that really fascinated me was just people watching, and watching people of the, that would have been my grandparents' age. And you just look at them and just think, what did you do? Where were you during this time? And, where are you from? And not wanting to blame anybody, and not wanting to, but it was just kind of something that I got a bit obsessed with. And I did a lot of reading when I was living there, and I went to a lot of concentration camps. And this was before I'd been asked to make this proposal. So I'd been thinking about all of these things, and I was trying to work out a way of sort of bringing these things together, but also because I know about Austria's history, and I also wanted to be quite brutal about it, and I didn't want to make it sort of what I think the Austrians were doing, which was to try, to sort of say sorry, and sort of also put a band-aid on it, and hope that, because they're not really very good at saying sorry, the Austrians, and they're a little bit in denial about what happened. And I wanted to really kind of make this point, but I had to do it very carefully, because obviously I couldn't let them know I was trying to make this point. So I was wanting to make something that was quite brutal. And as a library, using the books and turning the spines of the books on the inside, so you had no sense of what was written in the books. So it could have been lists of names, it could have been Jewish history, it could have been whatever you want it to be and can interpret it as. So sort of making this kind of bunker-like structure, then with these very sort of blank books, and these 2 doors that you can't open, that have 2 little holes where the doorknobs are, and they're the only way that sort of you feel like you could get into the piece. There's no light switch, there's no electricity plugs, there's no way in, there's no light, there's nothing. It's just this kind of blank space. I'm very glad it's over with, and I'm very relieved it's over with, and I'm now finally very, very proud to have made it. When I made House, the one thing that sort of frustrated me about House was the staircase. And when you went inside House, you know, because it was obviously made from the inside, what we had to do was we actually cut the staircase in half, or in actually left a third of it, and sort of it was attached to the wall still, and we cast around it. And it really felt like I'd cheated, and it always irritated me that somehow I hadn't managed to either pull out the wood where the stairs were, or somehow make it more complete. No one else knew this apart from me. It's purely my own kind of neurosis. And it had always niggled me, and this was in 1993. I didn't quite know how to make that form concrete, because if you look at a staircase, if you walk up a staircase, to sort of imagine that as a series of blocks or as a space filled with air, sort of mummifying the air, it's actually incredibly difficult to do, so it doesn't really have a beginning or an end. Every single staircase is different, and I just got very intrigued by the notion of how to try and make these things concrete, and then how to, you know, how by turning them, or by turning them upside down, or just by moving them slightly, you could completely disorientate the viewer, which is what I tried to do with a piece that was recently shown at the Serpentine. I think it's up to the person that's looking at the work to sort of work that out for themselves. So whether or not they decide to be excited about, you know, form, colour, texture, analysing the sort of history of a staircase, or analysing architecture, and, you know, whatever it is that people choose to use as their key to get into works, you know, I'm happy for them to do that. I'd been asked to put in a proposal for the plinth in Trafalgar Square, which I initially thought was a kind of crazy idea, and then spent the day there in Trafalgar Square and looked at this plinth, and it you know, it really is a very, very beautiful piece of architecture. And I decided that I wanted to put in a proposal for it, kind of, you know, in retrospect, probably quite stupidly, because it took an awful long time to make. And I came up with this notion of just simply having the plinth, making a cast of it, and making it in a clear resin and inverting it upon itself. So you just had a sort of reflection of itself. So it sounds very simple, and as all good ideas are, they take forever to make. And I spent literally, I think, about 4 years sort of trying to work out how to make it, and then finally making it and putting it out there. I just loved the idea of making something that was incredibly quiet and calm in this absolutely kind of chaotic city central, you know, location in the middle of Trafalgar Square. I kind of hate public sculpture, which is sort of sounds ridiculous considering I make it, but you know, I like the way you can almost make something kind of disappear. I mean, it was a bit, you know, again, the way the sort of press dealt with it and whatever, you know, they're calling it a glacier mint and all of that, which is, of course, you know, what you would expect. But I also think it was a very serious piece of sculpture, and to try and make something in a situation like that that kind of almost disappears, that you can sort of ultimately ignore if you want to, in the way that in Trafalgar Square, Nelson's column is kind of ignored. It's the most sort of ridiculous sort of folly, but it's an amazing thing as well. But it's sort of, people don't even really see it anymore. It's just there. To try and work with those things, and to try and work with the traffic and the buses and the National Gallery and the fountains and all of these things, and to just try and make something incredibly quiet that sort of sat there with some sort of dignity was what I was trying to do, and hopefully I achieved it.